All right, and good afternoon, and welcome to the RespectAbility webinar for April 8th, 2021. My name is Philip Konpali. I am delighted to be joined by the great professors from Rutgers University to talk about lessons learned from 2020. I realize that for many people, 2020 is a year that they'd like to forget. However, I think that beyond the COVID-19 pandemic, beyond the economic crisis, that the election that we all survived through that was so harrowing in so many respects was very informative, that it really shaped both the future of electoral politics, but more importantly, the active engagement of many underrepresented communities that had previously been, that had not been as involved or engaged, and foremost among them is the disability community. I am so excited that Lisa and Douglas from Rutgers have done incredible research on voters with disabilities over the last several election cycles. And they have been digging deep into the data to show really the trend of voter engagement for people with disabilities. And that is so important. Roughly around 1 in 5 Americans have some form of disability. Whether it's a visible disability or an invisible disability, and that number just grows bigger and bigger if you start to include family members and friends of people with disabilities. And RespectAbility's own polling work has shown that roughly about 51% of voters have some connection to disability. And in an American democracy, however fragile it may be, where you have to get 50% plus 1 to get the a majority to win the election, the disability vote is incredibly powerful. And I've been very excited to see, candidates engage with the disability community to talk about disability issues, to make disability part of their platform in unprecedented ways in this last election cycle. And this last election cycle really reflects the progress that we've made in the 30 years since the adoption of the Americans with Disabilities Act and the years since the Help America's Vote Act got passed to help get more people with disabilities out to vote. And as our nation grapples with the challenges to voter access and voter ID laws, and the creation or tearing down of more barriers to vote, I think that it's really an important moment to take stock and really look at where we are and where we are going. And there is no better starting point for that than the team of Dr. Lisa Schur and Dr. Douglas Kruse from Rutgers University. They are the co-directors of the Program for Disability Research. They are widely published on issues related to economics, employment, labor law, social policy, and they have done some great work that they are going to be sharing with us today. So I'm going to turn it over to them, and I'm going to start the PowerPoint deck. So here we go. All right, Douglas and Lisa, take it away.
Well, thank you so much for inviting us. We're very, very glad to be here. We're going to talk about disability and voting accessibility in the 2020 elections. And I will start, and then I will turn it over to Doug about halfway through. We're going to do kind of a tag team approach. So if we could have the next slide. So the questions we have are, what were the voting experiences like of people with disabilities in the 2020 elections? And how did they compare to the experiences of voters without disabilities? And a major question is, has there been progress in voting accessibility since 2012, when we did an earlier survey? And how did the COVID pandemic affect voting experiences? So to answer these and other questions, the US Election Assistance Commission, the EAC, they asked us to design and coordinate a national survey of voting eligible citizens with and without disabilities after the 2020 elections. But first, before we get into our results, what do we know about disability and voting from prior research? There were 38.3 million eligible voters with disabilities in the 2020 election. This is based on census data. And in addition, and this refers back to what you said, Philip, there were another 29.4 million people who did not have a disability themselves, but who lived in a household with someone with a disability. So in total, that's 67.7 million eligible voters, or 28% of the total electorate who either had a disability or lived with someone with a disability. So there's been this stubborn disability voting gap of about 6 to 7 points in general elections. And you can see that 2008, 2012, 2016. And this gap gets bigger when you control for demographic factors like age, gender, race, ethnicity, education, and marital status. So does that mean that people with disabilities care less about elections? The answer is a resounding no, that doesn't mean that. Surveys in 2016 and 2018 show that actually people with disabilities were more likely than people without disabilities to say that they follow the campaign closely, to say that it really matters who wins the election, and to be extremely interested in the elections.
And one of those surveys by RespectAbility.
Oh yes, a survey by RespectAbility. Thank you, Doug. All right, so if it's not a lack of interest, why do we see this disability turnout gap? It's partly explained by lower resources, especially lower income levels and education levels among people with disabilities. Greater social isolation, people with disabilities are more likely to live alone, they're less likely to be employed. They have, in general, a lower belief that the political system is responsive, and clearly voting difficulties play a role here too. In a US GAO study, 83% of polling places in 2016 had one or more potential impediments to voting. That's 83%, large number. A Rutgers National Household Survey of 3,022 citizens in 2012 found reported problems in voting at polling places for 30% of voters with disabilities. That's compared to 8% of voters without disabilities. Inaccessible polling places and voting procedures obviously make it more difficult to vote, and they also can have psychological effects. They send the message that people with disabilities are not welcome in the political sphere. So analysis of the 2012 survey data find that voting difficulties predict lower perceived influence of people with disabilities in politics, and that perception of lower influence, less influence, predicts lower voter turnout among people with disabilities. So going back to this 2020 post-election survey, this was a national sample based on randomly selected citizens who were eligible to vote in the 2020 elections. It was designed to update and expand on that 2012 post-election survey that we did that was also funded by the EAC. Both surveys were conducted by SSRS, which is a respected polling firm. It's a member of the American Association of Public Opinion Research. The disability measure was based on a 6-question set that's been used by the census, plus a 7th question, a broad question, designed to capture other types of disabilities that the census questions don't get. The total sample size of all participants was 2,569. The people with disabilities made up 1,782, and people without disabilities were 787. The citizens with disabilities were oversampled because we wanted to get a large enough sample to make reliable estimates and do breakdowns by type of disability and demographic factors. So this total sample is, can you go back for 1 second? It's actually twice as large as the typical national phone surveys, which usually have 1,000 people. So we're confident that our results can generalize well, both to the disability and non-disability populations. Okay. So our total report has 32 detailed statistical tables, and we're not going to go through all of those here. All the results use weights to reflect the full disability and non-disability populations. And the report notes which differences are large enough to be statistically significant, so that we can be very confident that we're really seeing a true difference between the populations. So we're just going to highlight some of the key results in the next slides. So we are happy that our disability sample reflects the overall US disability population. Almost half of our respondents with disabilities have mobility impairments, a quarter have cognitive impairments, a sixth have hearing impairments, an eighth have vision impairments, a quarter have difficulty going outside their homes alone, and an eighth have difficulty with self-care inside their homes, and a third need help in activities of daily living. So people with disabilities voted at a 7% lower rate than people without disabilities of the same age. And this does point, of the same age, I want to stress that, that points towards a continuing disability gap in voter turnout that we found in past elections. But I want to stress this, the disability gap may have narrowed in 2020, and we're going to have better sense of this when the Census Bureau's voting and registration supplement data set is released at the end of April. I think it's April 21st. We'll have that big data set. So we'll be able to see more then. So we have some good news. Voting difficulties among people with disabilities declined markedly from 2012 when we did that prior survey to 2020. They dropped from 26% in 2012 to 11% in 2020. However, about 1 in 9 voters with disabilities said that they had difficulty voting in 2020, and this is double the rate of people without disabilities. So we've seen progress, but it seems that problems are still there. So what types of methods for voting do people use? Almost half, 49% of voters with disabilities voted at a polling place in 2020, and that's compared to 56% of voters without disabilities. And there was a big shift to using mail ballots from 2012 to 2020, and it was identical. The shift was identical for voters with and without disabilities. There was a 28% point increase, and that clearly reflects the COVID pandemic. 1/4 of voters with and without disabilities, 24 and 25%, voted early at a polling place. And close to 3/4 of voters with disabilities voted with a mail ballot or early in person in 2020. So this is a significant increase from 2012 and is higher than the 2/3 of non-disabled voters who did this in 2020. So what kind of difficulties did people with disabilities experience when they voted in person? Among the people with disabilities who voted in person in 2020, 18% reported difficulties. That's compared to 10% of people without disabilities. This number is down from 30% in 2012. The difficulties were most common among people who had vision impairments and cognitive impairments, 30% among people with vision impairments and 24% among people with cognitive impairments. Yes, so I'm going to turn it over to Doug now to talk about polling place accessibility. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm also very, very pleased to be talking with you. We're very, very interested to hear your questions and comments and ideas about this. As Lisa said, the rate of difficulty in voting in a polling place declined from 2012 to 2020. So you might say, well, that's great. Polling places are becoming more accessible. And we do estimate that about half of that decline from 30% to 18% in difficulties, about half of the decline does appear due to progress in making polling places more accessible. The biggest declines in difficulty were in difficulty reading or seeing the ballot and difficulty understanding how to vote or use the voting equipment. Also, there are possible declines in difficulty finding or getting to the polling place and waiting in line, but those declines were within the survey's margin of error, so we can't be highly confident. The other half of the overall decline is actually tied to that increase in mail voting due to the pandemic. There's a change in, we estimate there's a change in composition of polling place voters. Those who expected the most difficulties in voting in a polling place were the ones who were most likely to switch to using a mail ballot, as mail ballots became more easily available last year.
Yeah, M-A-I-L, not M-A-L-E.
Right.
Yeah.
Whenever I say mail ballots, people
Yes.
think male as opposed to female ballots? No. Okay, go on. So there was a lot more use of mail ballots, obviously, but mail ballots don't solve all the problems associated with voting for people with disabilities. Among those using mail ballots, 5% of voters with disabilities had difficulty using the ballot, compared to 2% of voters without disabilities. And those difficulties can include problems in getting the ballot, filling it out, sending it back, being able to return it. We found that the biggest problems, and this is not terribly surprising, were among people with vision impairments. 22% of voters with vision impairments had difficulties using a mail ballot. And typically, of course, if you're blind, you will not be able to fill out a mail ballot by yourself. You need the help of a friend or family member, in which case you're not voting confidentially. And that's a real problem. We asked who needed assistance. Among voters with disabilities, 6% of in-person voters needed assistance, and 11% of male voters needed assistance. We combined the assistance and difficulty measures to make an estimate of how many people voted independently, that is without assistance, without difficulties, and found that 5 out of 6 voters with disability, 83%, voted independently without difficulties in 2020, compared to over 9 out of 10, or 92% of voters without disabilities. Among those using a mail ballot, 1 in 7 voters with disabilities needed assistance or encountered problems in voting, compared to only 3% of those without disabilities. So there are some real gaps there, not just in the polling place, but in voting by mail. Excuse me. We asked a whole variety of questions about the voting experience in the survey, and those measures are all available in our full report. I'll just highlight a few of the more interesting questions here. We asked people about who voted in the polling place. How were you treated by election officials? Among in-person voters, people with disabilities were actually more likely to report that election officials were very respectful toward them. 84% said that, compared to 77% for people without disabilities. So that's interesting. A more negative note, though, is that the perceived respect from election officials appeared to decline slightly from 2012 for voters both with and without disabilities. We don't know entirely why this is, but we're speculating that it may be due to the stresses of the pandemic. 2020 was a crazy year for all of us in so many ways, and we think some of that may have spilled over to the voting process. Another question we asked was, how confident are you that your vote was accurately counted? And interestingly, here we found that 2/3 of voters with disabilities, 68%, said they were highly confident the vote was accurately counted, which is actually higher than among voters without disabilities, 59% for voters without disabilities. On the other side, or at the other end, close to 1/8 of each group, 13% for each group, said they were not very confident or not at all confident their vote was accurately counted. The results for that were very similar for in-person and male voters. Another question we asked was kind of interesting, I think. We asked people who voted this past year to compare the ease or difficulty of voting to the last time they voted before the pandemic, just a subjective comparison. How was it post-pandemic versus pre-pandemic? Overall, most voters with and without disabilities, 63% and 64%, said it was about the same. But mail voting seemed to help. Among those who voted in person before the pandemic, but with a mail ballot in 2020, close to half of voters said it was easier in 2020. 50% of voters with disabilities and 53% of voters without disabilities. In addition, 1/4 of voters with disabilities, 23%, who voted in polling places both times, both in 2020 and the last time they voted pre-pandemic, said it was easier in 2020, compared to 13% of voters without disabilities. That's really interesting because it does help to validate this idea that polling places really are becoming more accessible. People who voted in polling places both 2020 and pre-pandemic, the people with disabilities were more likely to say that it was easier in 2020 than were people without disabilities. So that does provide some validation of the increased accessibility idea. We also asked if you wanted, and we asked both voters and non-voters, if you wanted to vote in the next election, how would you prefer to cast your vote? Trying to get a sense of people's preferences here. We gave people 5 options. The most popular option by far was voting in a polling place. You might think, well, after so many people voted by mail this last year, that's really the wave of the future. People discover how easy that is, and that's the wave of the future. However, close to half of people with disabilities, 49%, and 3/5, 61% of people without disabilities said they would prefer voting in person inside a polling place, showing the important value there of voting in a polling place in a public way. The next most popular option was voting with a mail ballot, chosen by 1/3, 32% of people with disabilities, and 1/5, or 19% of people without disabilities. The other 3 options, the choices did not really differ significantly by disability. About 1/8, 12 to 14% chose voting fully online by personal computer or smartphone. Just pull out your smartphone and vote that way. 4 to 5% chose filling out a ballot online and then printing and mailing it. That's also known as electronic ballot delivery, and it can be especially good for people with vision impairments, where they can confidentially fill out a ballot online on their computer and then just print it out and mail it. And they can do it confidentially without anyone's help. And the last option, 3% chose voting by drive-through or curbside. We have a bunch of other topics covered in the survey report. We look at the relationship of disability to non-voting forms of political participation. For example, working for a candidate, contributing money, writing a letter to a paper. We ask about, I think, 8 or 9 different kinds of political participation. We ask about political interest and feelings of political efficacy. And we do find, I'll just mention briefly that we asked a standard question about, do you follow politics? And people with disabilities were more likely than people without disabilities to say that they followed politics closely last year. Recruitment for voting. We asked questions about, did anyone talk about voting with you? And that is a strong predictor of voting in general in past research. And that's a big issue for people with disabilities. As Lisa mentioned, social isolation can be a real limitation for political participation of people with disabilities. And we asked about other facilitators of voting: employment, group involvement, transportation, attending religious services, education, and income. And we've got a lot of results there, which we're glad to talk about. So, conclusion, key takeaways. Voting accessibility for people with disabilities does seem to have improved since 2012. Some of that improvement was due to the increase in the availability of voting by mail, but some of it is also due to improved accessibility of polling places. Despite this progress, though, 1 in 9 people with disabilities encounter difficulties in voting, and they're twice as likely as those without disabilities to experience these difficulties. We don't have this in the report, but we make a rough estimate that based on the past numbers from 2016, we're estimating that probably 19 or 20 million people with disabilities voted. And that means that this 1 in 9 people with disabilities who encounter difficulties, that's about 2 million people. 2 million people with disabilities encounter difficulties in voting. That's a large number. And that points to the need for continued progress in improving accessibility and ensuring people with disabilities can easily exercise their right to vote. So that's our presentation. We'll stop it there. We welcome questions, and we're very committed to making these results as useful as possible for people with disabilities and election officials and policymakers and everyone.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Doug, and thank you very much, Lisa. Our audience has two options for asking questions. We've got the Q&A box down on the bottom of your screen. You also have a chat box. Eric, who is off screen, is helping coordinate things. If there are any questions from Facebook Live, just give me a shout out and I will share them live. I know I have a bunch of questions I want to ask, but I want to offer a few kind of comments and responses to what you had to say. And I think it's really interesting seeing as you say, that continued desire to vote in person. And I certainly, I voted by mail myself in this election. I filled out my ballot, I put it in the envelope, I dropped it off. And there was definitely a part of me that was like, this is nice and easy and it's flexible, but, I kind of like, standing in line and going in and putting it in the box and, going behind the curtain. So I can understand that kind of that visceral emotional desire to feel like you're participating instead of just dropping off a bill. But, more accessible voting is good voting from my perspective. In terms of, that dichotomy of, mail is great for a lot of people. It's driven, an opportunity for more voters with disabilities to be engaged, but it's, exclusionary for people with visual disabilities. I'd be really curious what some of the advocacy communities in places like Oregon or Colorado, where there's mail-in voting, what they do to try and make sure that people with disabilities can participate. I think and that also means I think of my advocate mind that that is a goal that you could work towards of if you could get your local groups that serve the blind together to say, all right, how are we going to get our people out to vote? And I also think it also offers a real challenge of, people with disabilities. We want to vote just like anyone else. We want to participate in civil society just like anyone else. But, there are a lot of states that are trying to restrict mail-in voting options. They're trying to restrict the rules around voter registration. And that directly, can have the effect of disenfranchising people with disabilities. And as you say, if from my perspective, and I'm speaking, from my advocate perspective, if 2 million people with disabilities have difficulty voting, that's 2 million too many. Just a last point before I pivot to the questions I have, I would just like to bring up a different poll that just came out recently, and it's a poll around the president's proposed infrastructure plan. And one of the pillars of that is the caring economy. And they specifically talk about expanding home and community-based services for people with disabilities. And I was just surprised to see a very technical issue such as HCBS, which people with disabilities know intimately. We have to try and get our services that way. We have to, help our family members or advocate on expanding HCBS. A Morning Consult poll about that actually found that 76% of registered voters were in favor of expanding disability services, and that 86% of Democrats and also 64% of Republicans. And so, even working in Washington, it's hard to say it, but there are Republicans with disabilities, there are Democrats with disabilities, because there are Americans with disabilities, and that's why understanding these issues is so important. So, all right, I don't immediately see any chat box questions, but I am curious. What do you think? What do you think that, state level disability organizations should do to collaborate around getting more people out to vote? What are some of the lessons you think that, local communities can adopt around promoting accessible voting in the elections to come?
I can start. I think groups like the American Association of People with Disabilities Rev Up campaign, which is basically web-based recruitment and information sharing among people with disabilities, is terrific. I mean, that, as we mentioned before, isolation is a major barrier for a lot of people with disabilities, and also lack of recruitment. And we know that recruiting people, asking people to vote, talking to them about candidates makes a difference. So I think expanding these kind of programs to reach out to people with disabilities, either virtually or in person when we can, is absolutely essential. Want to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. We are not policy people, so we don't have a whole set of policy proposals. But exactly what Lisa said, that it's very important to make connections to people with disabilities to help convince them to vote. We also think, from a policy perspective, we don't have the, as I said, we don't have the microdata yet from the Census Bureau to look at exactly what the turnout gap was this last year, but we're thinking that the disability turnout gap may have decreased because of the increased availability of mail ballots, the increased options that people with disabilities have. From a policy perspective, having more ways to vote is good for people with disabilities. Basically, there's a real basic point that there's such a wide variety of types of disability, types of limitations that people have. And when you've got that wide variation, then you also need wide variation in ways to vote. So the more options there are for voting, that maximizes the chance that people with any particular type of disability will be able to vote. So we are in favor of keeping more options, making it easier to vote in general, which we think especially helps people with disabilities.
Definitely. And one thing I know that is obviously a huge barrier that many people with disabilities live with is transportation. We have to rely on the bus. We don't have on cars. And I'm wondering, does any of your research reflect the impact of transportation as a barrier to voting? Because we know it's a barrier to employment.
You want to go?
Well, yeah, it's a good question, and we did ask some questions about that. To be honest, we actually haven't had time to analyze these data yet fully in the survey on transportation. From past research, we do know that transportation is important. One interesting finding is that people who are able to, we found this in some past research, people who are able to drive a car have much higher turnout. Well, is that due to the actually driving a car? Or is it due to other characteristics associated with being able to drive a car? We don't know that for sure, but it is clear that that increased mobility makes a big difference. I might mention, and this is not, apart from the transportation, we do find that employment is a tremendously big factor in voting of people with disabilities. That in fact, there's no turnout gap between employed people with and without disabilities. And that, again, may just reflect the greater social contact, greater being part of mainstream society, along with with the extra resources, the income and so forth that get provided by employment.
Gotcha. And I will say, I definitely heard some interesting solutions to the transportation to vote issue. I was interviewed on a radio program back right after the election happened by a local public radio station in Baltimore. And my spot about voters with disabilities aired shortly after a spot talking about local funeral homes, which obviously have limousines where they transport the family to a cemetery. And so all of the local funeral homes and morticians got together and would drive people to the polls. And I also thought that was a great metaphor about how voting is a matter of life and death. But it also proposes that communities can find really innovative solutions to getting people to vote. And so, I am curious, do you think that, I'm curious, one, do you see, well, obviously there's people with disabilities in every community across the country, but I'm curious, do you see any divisions in voter turnout between red states and blue states, or between urban communities and rural communities? And if you don't have the data, that's fine, but I'm curious, dig into that if you can.
Yeah, we're going to be looking at that. We can't do state by state comparisons right now because our sample sizes become really small. But we can aggregate some of the data, and we're planning to do that soon.
Yeah, our sample size, as Lisa said, is close to 2,600, which is really large for a national sample.
Yeah,
but it doesn't allow us to do state by state comparisons. When the census data come out this next month, that has a much larger sample, like 90,000, and we can do some state-by-state comparisons. Of course, the census data, we asked a lot more questions in our survey than the census asked.
Yeah.
The census asked just about voter turnout and if you did vote, did you do it, in person or by mail? And they ask a couple other questions, but that's basically it. They don't ask about all the voting experience, the voting difficulties, and so forth. But when those data come out, we will jump on it right away and see what it can teach us about the differences between states.
Yeah.
Red versus blue states, or states that expanded voting by mail access. And I like the idea as well of comparing rural versus urban areas to the extent that we can do that. That's really important. The transportation issue, I think, is going to be more important one in rural areas.
And that's what got me thinking about that. And I will say, thinking about things that states are talking about in terms of promoting access to voting, I would be curious to see what the results would be in California, which has automatic voter registration.
Yes.
And that makes things easier. Do you have any data or comments about that?
Well, I think we're in favor of that. Anything that makes it easier is something that we're in favor of. It shouldn't be an extra burden to register to vote. I also like the idea of, like, this year in New Jersey, in 2020 in New Jersey, everybody got a mail-in ballot. That was just an automatic thing. All citizens got one. And you could decide if you wanted to fill it out and return it or go vote in person. And that is a wonderful idea. Just kind of do that and give people more options.
Yeah, actually, it was the first time I voted by mail since my college days. Last year, there are now 5 states where they do all vote by mail. But last year, there were an additional 5 states, like New Jersey, that sent ballots to everyone, and plus Washington, D.C. So those 10 states plus Washington, D.C., we are going to be really interested to look at the turnout of people with and without disabilities in those states compared to other states. Past research that we've done has shown that the disability turnout gap is smaller. There is still a gap, but this gap is smaller among states with all vote by mail systems and states with no excuse absentee ballots available. That is, some states require you to have an excuse, and you have to check off I have a disability if you want to get an absentee or mail ballot. And that's our interpretation of the results there, is that a lot of people with disabilities don't like to check off on an official government form, I have a disability. There's still a stigma to having a disability. I think we all recognize that. And that when you are required to state that you have a disability in order to get a mail ballot, that is an additional barrier, an additional discouragement.
Yeah. Can I just add,
disabilities.
I'm sorry, can I just add a quick thing to that? Another barrier, another barrier is when you have to apply for a mail-in ballot for every election. So we think making it easier just to get a permanent mail-in ballot, no excuse mail ballot, not having to provide a reason why you want one is the way to go.
Gotcha. All right. Well, I think you've stunned the audience into silence, which is, sometimes that's what you like. And I think there's a lot of really interesting lessons of this. And, I certainly will dig into the report. I will look forward to the future data that you have that you will bring to bear. I will also say that given that, RespectAbility is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization dedicated to working with anyone who wants to understand these issues, I think there's an opportunity for state parties to look at primaries. And I'm cognizant of that because in Virginia, we've got a gubernatorial primary coming up, and one party has chosen to do an in-person members only event, whereas the other party is doing an open primary, as it is always. And we're talking about that question of barriers to voting and lessons for the future. So I am going to thank the team from.
Can you just add just to reinforce one of the points you made about voting in person? You want to describe our focus groups?
Just really quickly.
Focus groups, talk about.
We could talk about this all day, but we won't. We did 2 focus groups before we launched the survey because we wanted to refine our questions and get feedback from people with disabilities who had voted in the primaries. So these focus groups were, again, people with a variety of different disabilities who had voted in the primaries in 2020. And spontaneously, a number of people said that it was really important for them to vote in person. And just what you said, Philip, that it was personally significant and important for them to be seen with a disability, going to the polling place like everybody else and casting their vote. And that public aspect of it was very important to them. And I think that's a really important point. We don't want to just go to everybody voting by mail. Not only would that disenfranchise a lot of people with visual impairments, but also it takes away an important process, an important activity that we value.
Yes.
Yes.
We did one of these presentations some years ago, and after the presentation, a very nice older woman came up and said, you know, what I do with my friends is we make it a social event. They say, let's all go vote together, and then they go out for ice cream.
Yeah.
And you know, that's really what, quite honestly, that's what democracy should be about. It's about building community. It's about interacting with your fellow citizens. And so I think that's wonderful. And I'd like to get ice cream myself after every time I vote.
Well, I always take a special moment to listen to Elvis Presley's American Trilogy. Because that's a very patriotic song, and I think it captures that moment. But this has been wonderful. Team Rutgers, thank you so much for taking time with us. Thank you, our audience, for joining us either via Zoom or via Facebook Live. Track down their research. Please go and read the report in full, and I hope you will take away its lessons and go knocking on your local election officials' doors and say, what are you doing to promote greater voter accessibility for people with disabilities? I will also shamelessly plug RespectAbility's next webinar, which is Tuesday at 1:30 p.m. We're being joined by Mobility International to talk about a bright and future possibility of international exchange and study abroad, and ways to make those types of programs accessible to students with disabilities. And that is also that makes me hopeful for the future, because more people are getting vaccinated, more people are thinking about the future of international travel. And so I would hope that, folks who found this webinar interesting will join us for a different webinar. Eric just dropped the registration link in the chat box. And last question, Doug and Lisa, where can our audience find you or find your research?
Well, we're professors at Rutgers. If you, quite honestly, if you Google us, Doug Kruse or Lisa Schur, you can find us pretty quickly. But you can also find, our emails, dkruse@smlr.rutgers.edu and lschur@smlr.rutgers.edu. Those, I said those quickly, but you can find those pretty easily at the Rutgers website just by Googling us.
Yeah.
And we do have a website at Rutgers for the Program for Disability Research that provides links to all of our research on disability, including the voting research. And we are very happy to answer questions, hear ideas. We love it when people suggest questions that we hadn't been thinking about, like this rural urban question. We hadn't really been thinking about that, but now I'm going to go run some tests and see if there is a difference in the disability turnout gap between rural and urban areas. So if people have ideas, questions, please do send them. We want to make these results very useful.
All right. Well, I hope that everyone here takes that message away and we go out and make voting more accessible. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you for our presenters. And that concludes today's webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you.